clear social disapproval could, in principle, signal the beginning of exclusion, and exclusion from the group was a serious survival threat. This is why social criticism specifically receives such disproportionately strong encoding compared to other negative information of similar intensity. Your brain isn't just registering, "This was unpleasant." It's registering, "This may indicate a change in your standing within a relationship or group that matters for your well-being." And that interpretation, even when largely unconscious, triggers the kind of urgent, durable encoding normally reserved for genuine threats. Praise, by contrast, while genuinely valuable, doesn't carry the same urgency. Positive social feedback typically confirms an existing, already assumed baseline, that you're accepted, that the relationship is stable, that your standing hasn't deteriorated, rather than signaling new, threat-relevant information requiring immediate, durable storage. Confirmation of an already stable situation simply doesn't generate the same encoding priority as a potential disruption to that situation. There's a second layer that compounds this specifically over time, and it explains why this asymmetry quietly shapes self-image across years, not just immediate mood. Cumulative weighting in self-concept formation. Your sense of your own competence, likability, and worth isn't built from a simple, neutral average of all the feedback you've ever received. It's built from a weighted accumulation where strongly encoded negative feedback contributes disproportionately more to your underlying self-model than the much larger volume of more weakly encoded positive feedback, even when the positive feedback was numerically far more frequent. This means a person who has received overwhelmingly more praise than criticism across their life can still develop a self-concept disproportionately shaped by a relatively small number of strongly encoded negative comments. Not because the functional brain imaging studies have found that negative social evaluation activates many of the same neural regions associated with physical threat and pain, treating disapproval as a genuine signal requiring urgent attention and strong memory encoding. Positive social feedback, praise, compliments, approval, activates different neural pathways, more closely associated with reward processing, primarily involving dopaminergic circuits. Here's the critical asymmetry. Reward-based processing, while genuinely pleasant in the moment, doesn't carry the same urgency-driven encoding strength that threat-based processing does. Pleasant feelings, by their nature, don't require the same kind of intensive, durable memory consolidation that potential danger does. Because from an evolutionary perspective, missing a piece of good news rarely had serious survival consequences, while missing a genuine threat could be catastrophic. This explains why criticism and praise, even when delivered with similar emotional intensity, get encoded with dramatically different strength. It's not that you're choosing to dwell on the negative comment. It's that the negative comment was processed automatically and immediately through a system specifically optimized for durable retention of potential threats, while the positive comment was processed through a system that, while rewarding, simply wasn't built with the same encoding priority. Here's where this becomes specifically relevant to social feedback rather than negative events in general. For social animals like humans, disapproval from a group member historically carried genuine survival weight. Being criticized, rejected, or viewed unfavorably by someone in your social circle wasn't just emotionally unpleasant in an abstract sense. Across most of human evolutionary history, it represented a real, measurable risk to your standing within a group you depended on for protection, resources, and reproductive opportunity. A single piece of someone said something critical to you years ago, a specific phrase in a specific tone, maybe even the exact words, and you can still recall it with uncomfortable precision. Meanwhile, the dozens, maybe hundreds of genuine compliments you've received since then have mostly dissolved, leaving barely a trace. This isn't because the criticism was somehow more true, or more important, or more deserved than the praise. It's because your brain processes social criticism and social praise using fundamentally different neural pathways with dramatically different priorities for long-term storage. and understanding exactly why reveals something significant about how your self-image has actually been built over time. Most explanations of this stop at the term negativity bias and move on, treating it as a vague, general tendency without explaining the actual mechanism, or, critically, why it operates so much more powerfully in social, interpersonal contexts specifically compared to other kinds of negative information. By the end of this video, you'll understand precisely why criticism gets encoded with far greater strength than praise, the evolutionary logic that built this asymmetry specifically around social feedback, and a concrete method for correcting the imbalance, rather than simply being told to focus on the positive, which almost never actually works. Stay until the end, because the last part explains why this asymmetry quietly shapes your entire self-concept over decades, not just your mood on any given day. Let's start with the underlying mechanism, because it's more specific than a general tendency to notice bad things more than good ones. When you receive negative social feedback, criticism, disapproval, rejection, even mild disappointment from someone whose opinion matters to you, your brain processes it through pathways closely associated with threat detection, primarily involving the amygdala. This isn't a metaphor. Praise didn't happen, and not because they're choosing to ignore it, but because the underlying encoding asymmetry means negative feedback simply contributes more weight per instance to the accumulated self-model, regardless of how the raw numbers actually compared. So if this asymmetry is built into how your brain fundamentally processes social information, how do you actually work with it, rather than simply receiving the well-meaning but largely ineffective advice to focus on the positive? First, deliberately extend the processing time you give to praise rather than letting it pass through quickly. Because positive feedback doesn't receive the same automatic, urgent encoding that criticism does, you can partially compensate by consciously, deliberately dwelling on a genuine compliment for longer than feels natural, actively considering specifically what it implies about your actual competence or character, rather than allowing it to register briefly and move on. This doesn't fully equalize the encoding asymmetry, but it does meaningfully increase the depth of processing positive feedback receives, compared to its default, fairly shallow treatment. Second, separate the emotional intensity of criticism from its actual evidentiary weight. When a critical comment surfaces in memory with disproportionate vividness, explicitly ask, is this memory this strong because the criticism was uniquely accurate or important, or because negative social information is encoded more strongly regardless of its actual accuracy? This distinction matters enormously, because the strength of a memory is not reliable evidence about how true or significant the underlying content actually was. It's largely evidence about which neural pathway processed it. Third, actively keep an external record of genuine positive feedback, specifically because memory alone will reliably underrepresent it over time. A written or saved record of meaningful compliments, achievements, or positive feedback functions as an external correction to an internal system that wasn't built to retain this kind of information with the same durability as criticism, regardless of how much positive feedback actually occurred. Fourth, recognize that the disproportionate sting of criticism is not a reliable signal of its objective importance relative to everything else you've heard about yourself. A single piece of harsh feedback feeling more significant than years of consistent praise is not evidence that the criticism was uniquely true. It's evidence that your encoding system is doing exactly what it evolved to do. And recognizing that distinction allows you to weigh evidence about yourself more accurately, rather than simply trusting whichever memory happens to feel most vivid. Here's what ties this together. The criticism that stayed with you for years wasn't more accurate or more important than the praise that quietly disappeared. It was processed by a system specifically built to prioritize potential social threats over confirmations of safety, a system that made evolutionary sense when social standing genuinely determined survival. And that continues operating with the same urgency today, even though the actual stakes of most modern criticism are far lower than the stakes your ancestors faced. Your self-image was never built from a fair, balanced accounting of everything you've heard about yourself. It was built from a system that, by design, weighs threat far more heavily than safety, and understanding that is the first step toward correcting an imbalance that was never actually about truth in the first place. If this explains something you've experienced, tell us in the comments about a piece of criticism you still remember clearly, and try to recall just one piece of praise from around the same time. And if you want to keep uncovering the hidden mechanics behind your own self-image, the next video is right there, waiting for you.